So this question, how likely is it to move from one position to another position in society? This question is really about the concept of social mobility. Social scientists, economists, sociologists define social mobility as the movement between different positions within a social system. Social mobility is an important characteristic of stratification in any given society. Stratification is a key concept that's going to come out of chapter 4. And stratification means structured or persistent inequality. To say that there is inequality in a society could just mean at a snapshot, you look and you see two groups of people are unequal along some axes, education, income, something like that. Stratification is the idea that inequality in a society is some forms of inequality in a society are part of the social structure, are part of the fabric of the society. They're structured, they're persistent, they don't change very much. How much mobility is possible, or the extent to which you can move between positions in your society, tells us how open or how closed a society is. The terms open and closed societies or systems in this context have to do with mobility, not like how open-minded is a society, for example. So how do we know if mobility is possible or not within a society? At the structural level, we can think of societies as being either more closed to opportunities to change your lot in life, or societies that are more open, that there's more opportunity to experience mobility. In closed systems, your movement between social classes is limited to your ascribed status. Remember, we talked about ascribed statuses last week. Ascribed statuses are our position in society that we were born into, or it's the position that the society you're born into dictates for you. So in a closed society, your ascribed status, the social category that you were born into, kind of locks you in to a position in life. So examples of societies that are characterized as closed would be a society that has slavery as a form of labor relations, as a form of social relations, or societies that have caste systems. In those type of societies, the family that you're born in is in the position that family is in, is the only position you will ever get to experience in life. In an open system, there's more fluidity, there's more opportunities to move between positions, and where you are in that kind of system of stratification is more based on your achievements in life or your achieved status. So in an open system, you can achieve your rank in life. You can also lose your rank in life in an open system. In a closed system, if you think of, in a monarchy, if you're born the son or daughter of the nobility, then you are nobility, right? There's no chance for you to lose that status. In an open system, you're born poor, and by 40, you become a wealthy corporate executive. If the stock market crashes or something, you can lose your position as a CEO in an open system. Okay, so most people assume that our social class is like in America, that social class and where people fall in the class hierarchy is largely based on achieved status. In other words, that the United States is an open system. Now, how do we know if mobility is possible or not, or how do we know how closed or open a society is? In our country, we really like individual success stories. Those resonate with us, the rags to riches stories. On the slide here, I have an image of LeBron James. And even if you're not a professional basketball fan, I think LeBron James is sort of a household name in most people are familiar with his biography, or at least the general narrative of his biography. So LeBron James is born in Akron, Ohio, which is in a inner city Akron, Ohio, which is a poor neighborhood. He was he was raised by a single mother. His mom was low income, so he was in a low income family and a low income neighborhood. Uh, but by all accounts, the odds were stacked against him. And now today, he is not only one of the highest paid professional athletes, but also probably one of the most recognized celebrities globally. And so we point to stories like LeBron James and other sort of examples of that as hope for our own upward mobility, but also as proof or evidence that we live in an open society here in America. As you go through the reading and the material this week, it will really push you to think about, well, what kind of evidence might suggest that our society is not so open? That rags to riches stories are the anomaly or are the outliers that they're not the norm or the expected experience. Before I go over some examples of some other kind of evidence, some other research that challenges this idea that America is a wholly, totally open society, let's go over a few more definitions related to this concept of social mobility. Okay, so on the slide here, as it says, mobility, social mobility, your movement between classes and society can either be horizontal, side to side, or vertical, up and down, and it can take place on the individual level or the group level. Horizontal mobility refers to changing positions but staying in the same class. So if you and this is pretty common. If you change jobs, but you don't really get a promotion or a demotion, you're just changing a position, that might be horizontal mobility. So if you're a social worker or you're a counselor and you work in a clinical setting and then you go into the school setting to do school counseling, that's an example of horizontal mobility. You didn't completely shift your class position, but you did change. There is some change occurring. So that's horizontal mobility. Vertical mobility is the one that we're more familiar with. This is up and down. This is movement up or down the social ladder. And so typically this is called upward mobility or downward mobility. If you're a clinical counselor or if you're a social worker and you meet a woman and she's like the top CEO at her firm or something, and now you marry her, well, by virtue of your new wife and her economic earnings, you have now experienced upward mobility, right? So I think we're all familiar with upward mobility is when someone increases their class status. Downward mobility is when someone loses their lot in life. Sort of the person that was the CEO and now they're living on the street, homeless. They've lost it all kind of situation. There's also so the difference between mobility that can happen within your lifetime or at the individual level versus at the group level is also kind of depicted on this slide here. If you are born rich and you die poor, or if you're born poor and you die rich, then within your lifetime, you have experienced mobility. And that's called intra-generational mobility. Within one generation, that's the mobility. A lot of times, we think of mobility in terms of intergenerational mobility. So not only what kind of positions and earnings might you gain or lose in your lifetime, but also when you look at your family, when you look at American society, like how have we done over time is intergenerational mobility. So in general, people are much more likely to experience horizontal mobility side to side movements in life than we are to experience upward and downward mobility. However, most Americans still strive for upward mobility, and our American dream still idealizes the possibility that we can all achieve upward mobility. Structural mobility is another type of mobility. Structural mobility is when changes in the economy, for example, shift our social structure in a way that directly impacts your class standing. And this is kind of a paradox or a conundrum a bit, because in America, where you fall in the class system, whether you're poor, middle class, or rich, we typically think it's based on people's own effort, right? And their own ingenuity and their own ambition, right? The people that work hard are gonna take advantage of this open opportunity society we live in. And people who end up poor are probably the ones that did not take advantage of all of these opportunities that American society presents. Structural mobility, the concept of structural mobility, makes that argument, challenges that argument a little bit, that through your own effort, if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can make anything happen in this society. The idea of structural mobility is that sometimes society will shift in a way, regardless of what you did or didn't do, and it will directly impact your class and your economics. So earlier this semester, remember we talked about industrial capitalism, industrialization, urbanization. We learned that during the period that sociology was kind of being born as a field of study, industrial manufacturing jobs were beginning to supplant farming and agriculture as the dominant economic form. I showed you some graphs where it was like this many Americans worked in agricultural, 90% of Americans worked in agriculture, and how that declined throughout the 1800s into the 1900s as manufacturing jobs, as factory jobs kind of replaced them. This graph kind of shows us this period of this peak period of industrialization, followed by a period of industrial decline. And so this is just an example of how structure can be more powerful than individual hard work. I don't think any of us, whether or not you know someone who's a farmer or who's in agriculture, I don't think any of us would argue that people who work in farming and agriculture are lazy or are not hard workers, right? But I don't think we would expect someone in farming or agriculture, the average worker in that industry, to make a lot of money, right? In terms of factory jobs, there was a point, especially in the post-World War II years, where if you got a good unionized job at a steel factory or an auto manufacturing plant, you could really elevate yourself, your family into the middle class, the upper middle class through just working hard, right? Making sure you clock in your hours at the job, you retire after so many years, and you collect your pension. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and Cleveland is one of these cities that really was dependent on manufacturing. And during the period of industrialization, Cleveland was really an economic powerhouse. And there's a ton of men, mostly men, who were employed in the steel industry, for example. And this would have been like maybe my grandfather's generation. And there were good jobs to be had. Now there were issues that we could talk about and unpack later, but this sort of period, this post-War II period in Cleveland, where I'm from, it looms large because everyone had a job and everyone had a good job, right? And then all of a sudden, come like the 1980s, we start to see a decline in jobs in industrial manufacturing, partially due to technological advancements, partially due to globalization. But so then my father's generation, the jobs that his dad worked at the steel mill didn't exist when he was coming out of high school, right? And now there's a whole generation of men in Cleveland and cities like Cleveland who in a previous generation probably would have been gainfully employed in a manufacturing plant, and now still work in manufacturing, but aren't commanding the same wages that they would have in the 1950s or 1960s. Now, I don't think any of us would argue that somebody who does backbreaking manual labor is lazy or is not hardworking. But this is just another example of how a shift in the economy to where now service sector jobs, jobs in STEM and IT are the highest wage jobs. Jobs in finance, those are the highest wage jobs, not the ones in farming and not the ones in factories. And again, this is not, so there's a bunch of farmers that went into debt, that went into poverty as a result of industrialization. There was a lot of steel workers that went into debt, that went into poverty as the result of de-industrialization and this technological boom, without any change in their effort levels, right? They didn't become lazy overnight. It's just that the opportunity structure shifted around them. What other kinds of evidence would we need to question the openness of our society? The American dream, as it's often stated and idealized, is based partially on this idea of upward mobility, again, vertical mobility. This idea that individuals in this society will move into a higher, part of the idea of upward mobility is that we will move into a higher social class than the one we were born into. That in America, given our opportunity structure, if you work hard, it doesn't matter if you're poor, you could be middle class. It doesn't matter if you're middle class, you could be rich. That's kind of our American dream, our ideal. What's interesting is that it was objectively or almost objectively true that, and we could almost predict it, that every American who was born was likely going to do better than the previous generation. And the graph here that I have on the screen is suggesting that that's changing a little bit. So if you were born in the post-World War II years, these are the baby boomers. These might be your grandparents. If you were born in the post-World War II years, and this is not a predictive model, this is just a graph that's plotting what actually happened, right? Around 90% of people who were born in the baby boom did better economically than their parents. Like they improved their position in life compared to their parents. But this trend has been declining over time. If you notice, most of us still believe that in the American dream, and most of us believe that or hope that we can do better than our parents have done. But what the data suggests now is very different. So I was born in 1988, and at the end of this graph, it shows 1985. But for my cohort, for my generation, the only about 50% of us are doing better than our parents' generation did. So for my mom could expect to do better than my grandparents. When I was born, I thought, me and my sister would do better than my mom, and my family would just grow in terms of upward mobility. But what the data is suggesting is that between me and my sister, 50% means one of us will end up doing better than my mom is doing financially. And we were raised by a single mom. So one of us will do better than mom did. And one of us is either going to replace our class status, meaning we're just going to stay the same, or we're going to experience downward mobility. So right now, about 50% of Americans will do better than their parents. The other 50% of us will either replicate the class of your parents, or you'll go down a notch. What other evidence do we need to kind of question this openness of our society? This is the last study or graphic I want to show you. And this comes out of a recent analysis by the Brookings Institution. And just like part of the American dream is the idea that the younger generations will do better than the previous generations, there is this idea in our society, and it's an ideal that I think most of you have latched onto, or your families have, which is why you're here. This idea that going to college can be a vehicle towards upward mobility. And in general, I think we have an ideal that America is an open society, that we are a society of open opportunity, that if you put your mind to it, that if you are ambitious, that if you work hard, you can get ahead and you can achieve a lot in this life. Part of what we also say in that is that one of the things that you have to do that's smart, that's like strategic, that's ambitious or whatever, is going to college, right? If you can get more skills, more credentials, that's a piece of the upward mobility puzzle. And so I want to share this report from the Brookings Institute that kind of challenges this idea a little bit. Their findings, there was some good news, and then there's also some like bad news, I guess. The good news is that students who go to college do see more returns over their lifetime of work, meaning you'll earn more after college between the time you leave college and the time you retire. People who get a college degree earn more than people who don't get a college degree. So that's the good news. The good news is that this push to go to college and better yourself, there's some objective truth to that. The bad news, or the weird thing, is that the class status that you start from really will shape how big those returns on college will be. Let me show you the graphic that they produced. Okay, so a couple things happening in this graph. If you take a look at the title, it says smaller bachelor bump in earnings for poorer kids. The bachelor bump is like, do you earn more by going to college versus the people, your classmates who decided not to go to college. And if you take a look at the X and Y axis, there's age plotted from 25 to 61. So those are your working years. And then there's earnings plotted in categories of 20,000, from 20,000 up to 120,000. What this data is plotting is averages. So this is taking like the entire population and putting it into 4 categories. People, and these are the blue lines. Let me use my mouse here. These are the blue lines, green line, aqua or light blue, and orange, this burnt orange color. So these are 4 different social categories. These are groups of people that are being plotted in this data. There are people, the groups are based on whether or not you have a degree, a high school degree or a college degree, and whether or not your family was poor or not poor. So the first one is all people who have a college, these are all college educated Americans whose families were not poor, meaning middle class or upper middle class. Above 185% FPL is meaning your family is well above the federal poverty line. So the first group is college graduates who come from middle or upper middle class backgrounds. College graduates who come from poor backgrounds is the green line. High school graduates who come from middle class or upper class backgrounds is this light blue. High school graduates who come from poor families, meaning your parents are earning below the federal poverty line, is orange. So those are the 4 categories. And again, like I said, there's some good news here. The good news is that all of the college students earn more than all of the high school students. The college graduates, earn more than high school graduates. So if you look at the blue line, the dark blue line and the green line, those are college graduates. And the fact that these lines are higher on the earnings axis means that there is evidence using, by the way, this is data from the panel study of income dynamics, which is a longitudinal study. Basically what this is saying, that compared to the people who didn't go to high school, which is these 2 lower lines, or who didn't go to college, compared to high school graduates, college graduates are going to earn more. So that's the good news. Like, on one hand, congratulations, you weren't lied to. College does improve your chances to earn more. But then there's some weird news. There's some like weird evidence in this data too. if you look at the navy blue line, if you notice, it's well above all of the other lines, right? And these are people who have college degrees who came from middle and upper class backgrounds. So they have a larger proportional increase in their life course earnings compared to all the other groups. You can also see another thing that's a little bit weird, right? So blue and green, dark blue and green these are people, everyone who earns a college degree. But these are people whose family, like who are raised in a middle class or upper class family. These are people who are raised in a lower income family. At the peak of earning for college graduates who come from low income backgrounds, which I would consider myself in this category, at the peak earning, based on this longitudinal data set, at age 43, people from poor backgrounds who had a college degree were just now earning what middle and affluent kids earned right out of college. So again, this blue line is middle class affluent kids who earned a college degree. Right out of college, on average, right, they're earning more than poor kids with a college degree earn at the peak of their career. So that's pretty astounding. So college does pay off, and college pays off in terms of your lifetime earning potential, but it will pay off even more for people who come from middle class or affluent backgrounds than it does for people whose parents are lower income. Now, that's the trend that the data identifies, but it doesn't really say why that's the case, right? That, like, it doesn't explain why going to college is worth more money, more bang for your buck for middle and upper class kids than it is for low income kids. But there are some other studies that highlight some possible theoretical explanations. On one hand, this is just objective, and this is not even sociological. You can look at Forbes magazine or Business Insider. You can look at like just the numbers, and it is true that the lower income students end up with a higher debt burden than any other student, meaning they take out more student loans. And the amount of student loans you take out when you're in college, right, the amount of debt you have in your early 20s is going to impact, right, your lifetime earning potential as you go through life. There's another book, another source of evidence comes out of a book called Paying for the Party. It's a 2013 ethnography of college women in college women's experience, both at college and then also as they transition into adulthood. And so in this book, Paying for the Party, they point out a couple possible explanations for why middle class and rich kids earn more after college than poor kids. One of the explanations had to do with social capital. Social capital are the assets and the resources that you can leverage from your social networks and your social connections. So it was true in this book, and the evidence for this book in this case, that upper class college students from middle class backgrounds typically had professional parents and professional relatives, and had this whole network that they could pull on for things like finding an internship, which is, you find the right internship during college, right? You get the right kind of experience, right? That helps you land a good job after college. They also talked about financial capital, which is just literally the money that you have and the different amount of money that people have based on who your family is and who your parents are. So if you come from a more affluent background or sort of more of an upper middle class background, then maybe you don't have to work, right? Maybe you decide, I'm never going to get a part-time job in college, and I'm just going to focus on my academics, which would, in theory, allow you to get a better GPA, be more competitive for internships. Again, maybe free you up so that you have more time to be social, to do, fraternities and sororities, and to do study abroad and the kind of extracurriculars that end up broadening your network, but also making you more marketable when you hit the job market at 24 or 22, I should say. And then also they found what was interesting in this case study, paying for the party, is that right after college, women who grew up in poor families or low-income families tended to move back home, back close to home, either literally back home with their family or back to their home neighborhood. As a contrast, affluent women who are like the opposite end of the spectrum than their low-income counterparts, typically after college did not return to their hometown, but instead went off to a big city, places like DC and New York and Chicago, to find opportunities. If you don't have a lot of student loan debt, and if you have financial support from mom and dad, or at least if you know you have a safety net financially for mom and dad, like there's more opportunity to kind of explore career opportunities outside of wherever home might be for you. So as you work through the material this week, it really will push you to reflect on what it means to be born into a wealthy family in an upscale neighborhood with nice schools and amenities versus what it might be like to be born into a low-income family with lower living, with lower quality of housing and lower quality or poor performing schools, etc. Class and economic inequality is something that for most of us in American society, we see it as an individual thing, right? We think of rich and poor in terms of hard work and laziness. But using a sociological imagination, which you'll be encouraged to do as you read the different reports and research studies that are presented in chapter 4, using your sociological imagination will, I think, be helpful in seeing how class and money and wealth and poverty is not just something that is experienced at the individual level, but it's something that is also patterned, or it's shaped by and it shapes larger social patterns as well.